İyi akşamlar. Bu kadar ıslak bir günde Taksim'in perişanlığı, hatta barbarlığı içinde buraya kadar inmiş olduğunuz için ben özellikle çok teşekkür ediyorum. Çünkü Simran diyor ki bana anlattıklarından sonra bu kalabalığı görünce kendimi çok heyecanlı ve şanslı hissediyorum. Belki 5 kişi gelir belki dedim yağmur görünce. Beni de çok heyecanlandı çünkü çok sevdiğim bir arkadaşım, dünyalar güzeli bir insan, çevreci. Çevreci olması bir tarafta sıkı bir akademisyen ve iyi bir araştırmacı, gazeteci Simran. Bugün bize gıdaya ilişkin, güvene ilişkin bir küçük egzersiz sunacak. Umut ediyorum meseleye özellikle siyasi boyut kazanmaya başlayan bir meseleye ilişkin farklı konuları tartışacağımız bir kapı açsın. Hoş geldin diyorum Simran'a ve hemen ona bırakayım.
The wonderful thing is I have absolutely no idea what Daphne just said. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. I know it wasn't easy after a long day and with the weather. I want to first thank Vasif and Melissa and Deniz and Daphne and everyone at SALT who's helped me get here this evening. I have had great admiration for this organization and I'm very excited to participate this evening. And what we're going to do, what you'll see here behind me, and these will just keep going on a loop. So you're not meant to necessarily read all of this, but if some word comes out at you, what I'm asking you or inviting you to do this evening is really think with me about what it means to trust what we eat, to trust farmers, to trust groceries, to trust all the links in the food chain that help keep us nourished every day. And trust is something that we often don't consider until it's gone. So what I invite you to do tonight is to really start to think about what trust means for you. It's particularly poignant for me this evening, and also at least for Jennifer and for several others of us in the room who might have some affiliation to the United States, thinking about trusting our leaders. Barack Obama was, of course, in the United States, just elected president this morning. And what also happened today was a proposition in California called Proposition 37. And that was to label genetically engineered or genetically modified organisms on the foods that we eat. There are many countries that require this labeling, but the United States is not one of them. And again, we have to ask ourselves, who do we trust? Where do we put our trust? And why do we trust certain entities in our lives? So this is what I invite you to do with me this evening. And this work is born out of a very particular request. A food conference in the United States invited me to speak. And they said, Simran, we'd like you to do something a little different. We want you to talk about trust in the food system. And I thought, I don't even know what that means. So the answer is yes, I'll do it. I have no idea what you're talking about. And I Googled it, actually, which I think is the first place many people start. There were 66 million hits on trust in food. So that didn't really help me. What I knew, even at that moment, though, was that the idea of trust in food or in the food system was a complete abstraction, right? That I didn't understand what it meant because I couldn't feel it in my body. But if we think about the experience of food, I mean, this is one that is universal. I am, by trade, an environmental journalist and journalism educator. And I talk about environmental issues through the lens of food, largely, and through the lenses of food and agriculture because they're so universal. One of the images that you'll see here is actually from Daphne and Vasif's table at their flat. And the moment of coming together and sharing a meal is one that is intimate. And it is also one that is universal. It's something that we've all experienced. These are relationships with food and agriculture. They're relationships that are complex. And they're ones that don't just mean one thing. We have connections to family, connections to history, connections to culture, connections to the environment, connections to the economy, connections to our work, connections to feeling good, connections to eating when we're feeling sad. That this is a very complicated relationship that we have. So one would think that we would have spent some time understanding what it means to trust in the food that we eat. But as I learned through the research that I've done and through the experiences that I've had, it was something that I had thought nothing about. So what we'll do this evening, you'll see the boards there on the left and right of you, is try to understand this experience for ourselves and try to make sense of not only what it means to mentally understand trust in food, but to feel trust in food, to try to make sense of what it means to feel trust on the palate, in the mouth, in the body, to get an embodied sense of what trust means in the food system. And what I did, what you see behind me, is I asked this question to a number of different kinds of people in the United States. And now I'm extending this inquiry first here to Istanbul, and then on to Rome and into Havana next month, to ask these same questions. In food we trust, what does that mean? And what does it mean depending on where you're coming from? So some of the words that you'll see here come from farmers. They come from people who are chefs in restaurants, from restaurant owners, from people who describe themselves as foodies, who just love food, from people who work at shelters that feed hungry people. There's for people who garden. I mean, there's a number of different experiences of what trust means. So that's what you'll see behind you. It's on a loop. So something maybe will jump out at you at some point. But first, I'd like to step back and ask each of you to think about the trust that you had to put to get here tonight. The trust, I'll tell you, I had to place in a pilot to get me across the ocean to Turkey. The trust I had to place in a taxi driver. The trust I placed in a farmer this morning when I was at the Adahan Hotel having a cappuccino, right? The farmer who brought that milk to that hotel. That there are links in the system that we take for granted, but that we have to rely on. Because if we were concerned about every link, we would never get out of bed or leave the house. So what does it mean to place trust in certain kinds of entities, right? And what does it mean to consider deeply what trust is and what is required to have trust in another institution or in another person? That's what we're going to explore this evening. So I'd like you to close your eyes, actually, which might be welcome at this time of the day. And I want you to, these are really comfortable seats, I want you to really just humor me, just do this with me. Just feel yourself in that seat. And just take a breath down. And exhale, and again, feel yourself in your seat. Get a sense of just how you're feeling in your body right now. Because this will change as we have this conversation. And I want us to use ourselves as the touch points for what the answer is, right? For how we garner trust. You can go ahead and open your eyes. I'll have you do that a few more times this evening. There's a global PR agency, which is an interesting place to reference. But they've done something kind of bold. They've created what they call a trust barometer. The PR agency is Edelman. And what they have described, first of all, trust is as behavior based on past performance, right? So in other words, trust is only something that we can understand if we know what someone has done in the past. And they surveyed people all over the world, 30,000 people all over the world. And they found that the institutions that people trust the least, can you guess what they are? Well done, government, right? That one didn't surprise me. But something else did. Who do you think would be second in that list of entities that would not be trusted? Lawyers. Business in general. Government was less, and this is abroad. You can go online and see the breakdown by various country and region. It's fascinating. But I'm just generalizing here to tell you, first it was business, government that was least trusted, then it was business. But what also ended up on that list, which surprised me, were NGOs. NGOs weren't trusted. But the reason that NGOs weren't trusted wasn't because of past performance, which is what makes this survey a bit interesting and strange at the same time, but it was because people didn't understand what an NGO was. So when they said, do you trust NGOs? Do you trust GMOs? Do you trust ISTs? I mean, the answer was no, because I don't even know what that is, right? Or maybe in some instances the answer is like, yes, because you tell me I can trust it, which we'll get into in a few minutes. But I found that incredibly telling, that trust wasn't something that was just based on what we know, it was also something that was based on what we don't understand. So Edelman did this exercise and learned sort of these different distinctions. But what Edelman also did not do was make any distinction between the kinds of governments, the kinds of businesses, and the kinds of NGOs that we're talking about. So, to stay with my US example, are we talking about a Barack Obama administration? Are we talking about a Mitt Romney administration? You say, I don't trust government, right? It's too broad. And that's why I'm inviting you tonight to get within your own body and to ask yourself this question in this very hyper-narrow way. What does trust mean to you? Because I think what we'll discover is trust is not something that's external, that's born through these outside entities. It's actually something that's deeply intimate to us. Trust, like food, is something that we can only experience. And through experience, we come to understand what trust is. There's no other way to do it. I can talk to you about how delicious chocolate is, right? I can tell you how happy it makes me, how it feels on the tongue, what it tastes like, the sensation, the sweetness. If you've never had chocolate, there's only so far you can go with that experience, right? It's just that simple. So that's what I'm inviting you to do tonight, is try to understand for yourselves what your experience of trust is. And as you move forward in the world, whether it pertains to food or it pertains to something else, then you'll have a better understanding of where your sense of trust comes from. So with that, I invite you to again close your eyes. This is good. This is better right for me too. Trust, as I mentioned, is like food. It's both a collective and unique experience, right? So keep your eyes closed. It's not a purely rational or intellectual experience. We feel trust. We feel trust. Now, one of the most important ways we understand what trust is to think about when that trust is broken. So I want you to think of a moment when you felt betrayed. I don't view that as a future behavior. I view that as something we feel immediately. Keep your eyes closed just for a few more moments. I want you to think about what you feel when you hear me say to you, I want you to trust me. I want you to trust me. Now, half of you might be thinking this is absolutely ridiculous. Why are my eyes closed? Half of you might be wondering, why should I trust that woman in red at the front of the stage? That's an excellent question. Go ahead and open your eyes. At the heart of how we build trust with others is understanding the conditions under which we trust. Right? Trust is something that is earned. And trust allows us to form relationships with other people. Right? One thing that we understand as we look into, as I've looked into the research now on trust, is that we depend on others for everything that we do, right? For sustenance, for love, for insight. We wouldn't get through our day without trust in other people. It would be impossible, unless you live in some sort of self-contained unit and don't generate your own electricity and make all your own food. Then you're different and special, and I bow down to you. But otherwise, I'm telling you, you have relied on a trust, an invisible chain of people to get to this place today. Right? Trust bonds are actually formed. We have a little baby here with us tonight. Right? Her trust bonds are being formed right now. Trust bonds are formed in the first 2 years of life. And they shape how we experience trust throughout our lives. But that isn't all. Trust is a dynamic construct that only occurs in relationship to another person. So in other words, I can't simply talk about trust just in myself. without understanding some sort of relationship I have with some other entity. Even to say, I trust myself, implies that I have some sense of understanding of what trust is that's based on another experience that I've had. This goes back to the Edelman definition around past experience. But there's a lot of other definitions that we can draw on. Aristotle, the philosopher, wrote in the Rhetoric that ethos, the trust of a speaker by the listener, right? The trust that you're forming right now when I ask you to trust me, was based on the listener's perception of three characteristics. The competence of the speaker, the character or reliability of the speaker as a measure of intentions, right? You believe, hopefully, that I have your best intentions at heart, that I'm not here to hurt you or to sway you in any direction, that I'm here to simply share information with you. And also the goodwill of the speaker, right? The favorable intentions toward people with whom the speaker is engaging. So we've been taught oftentimes to look at trust or understand trust as if it's a single entity, right? We trust government, we trust business, we don't trust NGOs or GMOs or what have you. It's not monolithic. Trust is built and maintained by a series of many small actions over time. And that is what that child over there will experience through her first 2 years, and that is what we'll continue to do through the rest of our lives. Right? That trust is, again, I talked about the links in the food system. Trust is a series of links. It's a series of small acts that becomes a singular experience over time. The author, Marcia Sinitar, says, trust is not a matter of technique, but of character. We are trusted because of our way of being, not because of our polished exteriors or our expertly crafted communications. There's a researcher who spent he started with his dissertation, Dwayne Tway is his name, and he spent his entire career trying to understand trust, and he's written some great books about this. But he says trust is the state of readiness for unguarded interaction with someone or something. So trust is about being vulnerable and about being open. So when I ask you to close your eyes and to feel what's in your body, I'm really asking you to experience what's here, not just what's here, right? Not just process what's here, but to actually have the experience, the embodied experience of trust. Tway calls trust a construct, and he echoes Aristotle. He says it's constructed of three components: the capacity for trusting, the perception of competence, and the perception of intentions. Right? So you can figure out by the end of our time together how trustworthy you think I am. As I mentioned, I'm an environmental journalist, and I tell stories of our world through the lens of food and through the lens of agriculture because they are the touch points for everything. Food is local and global, it's intimate and sacred, and it's a source of pleasure and disdain. And food feeds many parts of us. So trust in food, those who grow it, those who make it, is something that we literally take in. Trust in food is extraordinary because it is an embedded experience. That's the only way we can have it, is to taste that food and hope that we don't get sick afterward. Right? A chef from New York said, "We must be highly aware that the customer comes to us with the utmost trust, that they can put the food that we cook, that we manipulate into their bodies, and that all will be well." Trust, she said, is about what happens between us, right? And it's also about what happens in the world. If you think about reporting on the presence of toxins in local cheeses or the depletion of a common fish, right? We think about food and trust in the rubric of who provides not only the materials, the cheese or the lufaire, but also the messenger. Do we trust the person who's telling us these stories? So it's a complex process, trust. It's the story and it's the storyteller at the same time. Sometimes these things are one and the same, right? But sometimes they're distinct. So it's important to sort of, as we think about trust, to think about, are we trusting the messenger, or are we trusting the message, or is it both? So I want to get back to a more visceral sensation of food and trust. to appetite and pleasure, because that can't be overlooked. To the sense, this is what one of the people I spoke to said, the sense, the feel of trust in the mouth. What does trust feel like? What does trust taste like? As a food journalist in Rome explained to me, trust in Italian, is anyone here Italian? Well, you can correct me if you know Italian better than I do. Trust in Italian has a common etymology with faith, right? It's fiducia and fede. Trust is a total surrender in something or in someone else. You put yourself in the hands of something else. And this is what we do every time we eat a meal. We rely on that chain of suppliers that brought the food to our table, all the way back to soil and seed, right? To what's invisible, to the buried components of the food system. And it's not just about trusting those people or those resources. It's also about trusting ourselves and the choices that we make. So what builds these institutions of trust? Robert Putnam from Harvard asked he asked this question in the context of democracy, right? And he asked, looking at Italy actually specifically, he said, what makes democracy take hold? And what creates institutions of trust? It depended on, which I found fascinating, how many small, successful institutions of trust were already in place. So it goes back to that idea of many small acts building toward a singular experience. Many small links in the food system building toward a singular experience of trust. And we can apply this throughout our experience of food, right? But the problem is, food is separate and distinct from these other experiences. If we treat trust in the food system, or if we treat food, our most intimate commodity, like widgets, like our iPhones, like a plastic water bottle, I think we run into great problems. If we treat our bodies like machines that we're just putting this caloric energy into, then that trust will break. I speak about this very specifically, and I speak about this in the context of something that has happened in the last 24 hours, again, in the United States, but that has huge implications for the rest of the world. And that is a Proposition 37, legislation that we had hoped would pass in the state of California to label genetically modified organisms. Genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, are foods or seeds that are created through recombinant DNA technology, which means that it's a crossing of different kinds of species or different kinds of plants or different kinds of inputs that would never occur in nature. Some of the most popular ones have been created by Monsanto, and Monsanto has embedded their pesticides, Roundup specifically, into the seeds. In the United States, people have no sense of what's in their food. So we have put an incredible amount of trust in our food system. And we have, unbeknownst to most of us, put an incredible amount of trust in one company. Monsanto now owns 24% of the proprietary seed market in the world. That means roughly 1 out of 4 proprietary seeds, the seeds that we buy in the marketplace, the seeds that are patented, the seeds that are commercialized, are owned by one company. Again, if the monopoly is on a phone, that's one kind of a problem. When the monopoly is on food, what we need to survive, we're talking about a completely different set of issues. Now, Daphne and I were actually talking about this earlier, the question of why didn't this legislation pass? The legislation there's some complexity to it, but on the surface level, the legislation was, we want the right to know what's in our food. We would like our food to be labeled if it has genetically modified organisms in it. That's the legislation. 2 months ago, California was a state where this legislation was put on the ballot, was very much in favor of this, absolutely. 2 months later, this legislation failed. Now, when we were speaking earlier, when Daphne first said, why did this happen? I said, well, Monsanto alone spent $7 million on this legislation. You can imagine $7 million US, how many people could be fed for that amount of money. But cumulatively, companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Syngenta, Dow Chemical, Monsanto put over $33 million into this campaign. On the other side of the campaign, a compendium of small farmers, organic food providers, I think put something like $3 million into this campaign. We could say, because of money, right, this is why this happened. But then, of course, we can contrast this with the presidential election where the Romney campaign poured a lot more money into the election, the presidential campaign, than was, believed even possible. And they still were not able to win. So it's not the singular experience of money. So what does this come down to? What's the question? And I looked into this earlier today, and the question was, again, who do we trust? And what opponents of Proposition 37 were very successful in doing was saying, you can trust us. We feed the world, and we are telling you this food is safe, and we are telling you that we do not need to label it, because if it wasn't safe, we wouldn't sell it. Now, it's a pretty tricky situation, because the company that put the most amount of money into it, Monsanto, also has a history of, first of all, creating chemical warfare. That's how the company started. And then secondly, having a huge number of violations against them. But we have to consider both the message and the messenger. The message wasn't just that you should trust this food, it's safe. The message also that was targeted specifically at a Spanish-speaking population, low-income populations in the state of California, said, this will cost you money. This will cost your family on average $400 US more every year. Now we're talking about farmers who have very little money to begin with. And we are now saying to them, you can trust what we're giving you, and if you must trust it because otherwise it will cost you more, right? So there's a consequence for not trusting us. So at the end of the day, they won this fight. But we see this fight happening all over the world. These are environmental justice issues. If you think I don't know a specific example of food in Turkey, but if you think about all the farmers and landowners who have been displaced through gold mining throughout the country, all these people have been told, you will get rich now, you will get money now. But I can tell you from my work, gold is one of the most environmentally destructive mining activities on the planet. So what happens culturally to a place, what happens environmentally to a place is forever changed. We can't get that soil back. We can't depoison the water of arsenic. We can't take these things away once we put them in. But the companies have told us, you can trust us, and we'll pay you money. We'll pay you a tidy sum. These aren't easy questions to answer. That's what I'm trying to say. And what I want us to do now is to take a little bit of time to start to understand what it means to look at food in the same way that we've looked at something like a phone or a bottle of water, and to tease out what it means to have vulnerability in the food system. Because that diversity in our food system and that sustainability of our food system is critical. Why should we trust farmers and grocers? Why should we trust chefs? On what grounds, when you go to a local restaurant, when you go to a local grocery, on what grounds do you make those decisions? Why do you choose one grocery over another? Because you saved 5 lira? Maybe. Because the person smiled when they gave you your strawberries? Maybe. Where does that come from for you? How do you make these decisions? Only by dissecting these decisions can we start to understand what makes them important and how we map these decisions onto all kinds of decisions that we make, right? And what are we trusting our food providers to do? There are two chefs in particular that actually talk a lot about sustainability, but they talk about it in a way that really surprises me. One is an American chef named Thomas Keller, and another is a Spanish chef named Andoni Luis Aduriz. And they both talk about not having any responsibility to anything except the taste, right? To anything except a good meal. So they say, actually, we don't need to buy local food. We don't need to buy from local farmers. All we need to do is give you the best taste experience of your life. only responsibility we have, right? So then we have to take this to another level and ask ourselves, when we say we trust someone, what are we saying we trust them about? So I'm adding layers onto this because I really want you to think about the complexity of these questions. The chef's obligation, right, is perhaps first to taste, and then secondarily to maybe saving resources. But what is your obligation to yourself and to your family? I would disagree. I think chefs have multiple responsibilities, but if we just go with what these two chefs said, I'm asking you, as you make your decisions, who are you making these decisions for? What responsibility do you feel when you make these decisions? So I'd like us actually, I want to leave you with a quote, and then I'd like us to stand up and stretch and put some things on these pieces of paper. A neuroscientist named David Eagleman says, in science, we never talk about truth or proofs, but we talk about what the weight of evidence suggests at the moment. And that goes back to this idea that trust is mapped onto us in the first 2 years of our lives, but that this is a dynamic, fluid construct. The first time our heart is broken, we understand what it means for trust to be betrayed. Right? If you're someone who gets sick when you go and eat a meal, you all of a sudden realize what it means to have your trust betrayed. And you make a different set of decisions based on that. But it's only through these experiences that we start to dissect what this means, right? So he says, we only talk about what the weight of evidence suggests at the moment. We talk about the narrative, the best narrative at the moment. So what I'd like you to do right now, we have small Post-it notes. Yeah, we're going to pass out Post-it notes. And what I'd like you to do is jot down a few words or a short phrase telling us what you feel trust in food feels like, tastes like, looks like, what this means to you. I've left this wide open and I've left you with a number of questions, but whatever comes to your mind, you can take a few notes, and then a few Post-it notes, and then I'd like you to just paste them on the board. If you start to see someone else has said something that you said, put your Post-it over there, walk around a little bit, and see what's emerging here. See what kind of patterns we find when we start to talk about and explore trust together. And then we'll come back and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what I've found. So now we're all going to get up. And you'll have to share pens, which is good. That means you get to talk to the people beside you. And just maybe jot a few words down per Post-it, either a short phrase or some words, and then go ahead and put them on the boards. Sure, once you've written it down, you could have put it up. Just so you can, once you've written down your words about what trust tastes like, feels like, go ahead and put them on the board, and then you can walk around and take a look at what other people have said. And you can write it in Turkish or in English. Please write in whatever is comfortable for you. definitely don't trust you, speaker, ladies. That's my favorite one. Should we take a few more minutes? If you haven't walked around and seen, I moved them all onto these two boards. It's interesting to see what patterns are emerging for what trust is. Let's start. I'm wondering if the person who is brave enough to write "I don't trust" would tell us who they are. You don't trust. you know? It's interesting to look at these notes, and I mean, I want to ask you, would it put you too much on the spot to ask why you said that?
Why not?
Yeah.
I can't find a reason.
You can't find a reason. Yeah. She doesn't trust. So it's actually fascinating because it seems like that would be the logical starting place for all of us, right? That everyone would have to have the trust earned over time, but that we have to take these leaps of faith when it comes to something life-sustaining. That if I had to be familiar with the pilot who flew the plane, then I would still be waiting to take a flight to assemble. But that there is an element of skepticism that's critically important as we move forward. That we are constantly moving through and across this continuum over time. What is interesting to me about what came up, I don't know if all of you had a chance to look at these, but that nature came up a fair amount. And that farmers came up a fair amount. How many people here actually know farmers, have relationships with farmers? 5, 6. This idea of trusting a farmer is also one that is born out of narrative and out of an idea we have about who farmers are and what they do. I believe that is a relationship that we should be able to trust, but I think it's one that we should also have some healthy skepticism about. And when it comes to nature, again, maybe the question goes back to the sort of broadness of the spectrum of what nature is and where our food comes from and where it's grown. The most maybe specific response on the posts, the notes that I saw was my grandmother's Monty. Was that also you? Okay, so there is something you trust. After all, look at that.
I mean, not the ingredients.
You trust your grandmother, but not what she's put in it. Okay. I don't know quite how to tease that out. But I do want to share with you a couple of constructs on trust that I think are incredibly useful in helping us try to dissect this information for ourselves. What I hope you see from this exercise is that there's not one answer. Edelman surveyed 30,000 people and couldn't come up with a singular answer. And I think their definition that trust was only something based on past experience was also a bit of a weak kind of definition. That trust is a number of different things. And that trust is a number of different experiences. And that trust, even within a singular experience, is something that we have to dissect and still again ask the question, what do you mean when you say trust? What do you mean when you ask, who do I trust and why? And so on. And when we get deeper and deeper into that, we start to discover different things about our relationship with food, right? Maybe before I'd asked you this question, you had taken for granted a lot of people involved in feeding you every day, you know? And then I asked you to consider for a moment, who do you trust? Why do you trust them? And what do they bring into this experience, into the mouth, right, into the body? There are 4 trust constructs that I want you to carry away with you into your next meal and back into your life. And they are predictability, value exchange, reciprocity, and vulnerability, which I talked about at the beginning. Predictability, I think, is something that we all understand. Trust means being able to predict what other people will do and what situations will occur. Trust means that you'll show up for me. Right? Trust means that when you feed me, I'll be safe. I won't get sick. Trust means that maybe for some people, the food will taste the same every time. That coffee at Starbucks, that latte, will always be the same, whether you're in Istanbul, Delhi, Arkansas, New York City, it doesn't matter. That's what some people go to Starbucks for or McDonald's for. It's that experience, right? That's what trust in the mouth is within the context of that experience. It's predictability of the experience. It's also consistency of experience, right? And that is, again, something connected to our taste of home, right? When we feel something that connects us to not only familiarity, but to memory, to family, to history. Value exchange, which is the second of the four components I'd like you to think about, is that trust means an exchange with someone, right? When you don't have full knowledge about their intention and the things that they're offering to you. You do this every time you go to a restaurant. We put faith, right? We look at a menu, maybe we order something and we say, I hope this meal will be good. The kitchen is making the food for you, they're preparing it, and they're saying, I hope those people pay me for it at the end, right? That we both have a circle of expectation, that one will fulfill one agreement and another will fulfill another agreement. They're not the same agreement, but they're agreements that exist in tandem with each other. They are a value exchange. Trust also means reciprocity, which is different from this exchange. Trust means giving something with an expectation that you will receive something in return, right? This is qualitatively different than value exchange. Value exchange is perhaps more related to the commercial exchange that we're talking about. Reciprocity is understanding that when I extend myself to you, when I open myself, when I share with you, that something will come back to me in return, right? That it's a circular relationship. This is I think one of the challenges when we often think about trust is, I have trust in government, I have trust in NGOs, I have trust in this, that we look at this as a straight line kind of relationship. But the truth is, we have expectations that those entities will also reciprocate and will give something back to us. Vulnerability, or I should say before I leave reciprocity, right? I just want to emphasize that idea that it's a circular experience, it's not a linear one. But the one that I think is most overlooked and most important is that of vulnerability. It's the part of trust that gets us, again, away from the head and back into the heart. And I try not to use this too glibly. I know it sounds maybe a little silly sometimes, but it is my enduring belief that when we talk about food, when we talk about the environment, when we talk about issues that we care about, that what we're really talking about is something that we feel. It's a sensation that we have. It's a response that we have. It's a feeling that brings us to a certain place, that makes us want to return to a place over and over again. Vulnerability is about being truthful and is about having faith that people will do what they say they're going to do. And this is perhaps the biggest challenge that I have with the legislation that failed today, Proposition 37. The promise by Monsanto and by a number of those companies I cited earlier is that our food is safe and you can trust us. But this trust is somewhat unproven. What they base it on is a series of small studies that say that there haven't been any problems with human beings consuming genetically modified organisms. The challenge is there have been no studies that have been tested or tried on humans. There have been no human trials, with an exception of perhaps one giant trial. One trial that's been going on for about 20 years in the United States of America. Everyone. All the people who have not been told what's in their food. There's something called substantial equivalence, which is the basis upon which the government has decided that genetically modified organisms do not have to be labeled. They say this is substantially equivalent to regular real food, so we don't have to label it and we don't have to tell you what's in it. But of course the question we have to ask ourselves is why this same substantial equivalence doesn't exist in Italy, doesn't exist in France, doesn't exist in Germany, why there would be a different kind of level of equivalence in these places when we are all humans, all eating food, all exporting food and sharing food. So trust is about having faith and being truthful, and it's also about understanding we can't trust what we don't know, right? That's why when people were asked about NGOs, they said, we don't trust them, because they didn't know what NGO meant, right? It wasn't because they didn't inherently distrust or mistrust an NGO. And it's also about being transparent in the dealings that you have. One of the things that comes out very strongly in trust research isn't that people are singularly or unanimously all of these things all the time. I'm not always someone who will reciprocate with you. I'm not always someone who can engage in the exact way that you might desire in that moment. But the critical linchpin in this state of vulnerability, the critical point in people understanding or feeling a sense of trust in other people was believing them and having faith in them, right? Fede and fiducia. The idea that even if you make a mistake, you're able to be transparent about it and speak of it. And this occurs across the board in government, in business, in human people relations, one-to-one, that this was the reason that people formed trust bonds with each other. It wasn't because people had never failed or ever made mistakes. It was because when they did, they admitted that they were wrong. It comes back to that sense of vulnerability. So without evidence of its presence, right, trust is an abstraction. Trust is something that has to be manifested and realized and demonstrated. It has to be proven over and over again. It can't just be promised or spoken. Without this evidence, without this visceral understanding and experience of trust, it's an abstraction at best, and at worst, it's a lie. And I believe that comes full circle on who we are. Trust is about being authentic in who you are. Trust is about telling the truth, and trust is about telling the truth even when it's difficult. It's about being real and honest in your dealings with your friends, with your loved ones, with your customers, with your staff, with all with whom you engage. Food is our common ground, but trust is our common need. Trust is what binds us to each other. It provides a sense of interconnectedness. Trust as a social construct is one that happens only between people, as I mentioned before. It doesn't happen outside of a relationship with someone else. It's a relationship that we can only form and only explore together. So I invite you, as you move back out into your world, to start to think not only about who and what and why you trust, but ask yourself what relationship means to you. And dig underneath this kind of abstract quality of trust, or an even more abstract quality of trust in the food system, and ask yourself simply, what is my relationship to the Manti, to the grocer, to my mother, to the farmer, to the soil, to the seed? How have I formed that relationship? And what can I do to solidify it and make it stronger? Thank you all so much for coming this evening. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Following your logic about people not understanding acronyms, AGO, CGO, it seems that possibly the people of California, not enough of them know what GMO means, so they didn't see the relevance of voting it down if they didn't know what they were voting about. What is your knowledge about GMO and why we should know about it? Why it should be on labels?
So I'll answer that question in two parts. First, I would say the logic really came out of Edelman around the NGO, and the distinction that the reason people didn't trust wasn't because they didn't trust NGOs, but because they didn't know what NGOs were, because that was the follow-up question in the survey. When it comes to GMOs, I will tell you there's a great deal of confusion about what genetically modified organisms are. And every single one of us has eaten no matter where you've lived, has eaten a genetically modified organism, because that's what hybrids are. We eat hybrid fruits and vegetables all the time. The challenge is transgenic or genetically engineered foods. And these are the ones that are created through this recombinant DNA technology I was referencing earlier. Hybrids could occur naturally in nature. It's something that we manipulate, but it's something a sophisticated gardener can do. It's something that can also be done in a lab. But this recombinant DNA technology is not something that can be done or would ever exist in nature. At no point in nature would we be crossing chromosomes from pesticides with chromosomes from corn. That only occurs in one place, and that is through this technology that has been engineered by these companies. So my concern around GMOs, I would say, first of all, is absolutely what you're saying. There's a lot of misinformation because, again, to genetically modify something is actually something that's been done for millennia, and it's on the surface harmless. We've taken an acronym and we've made it very confusing for the public. What we're really talking about here is GE, genetically engineered, or transgenic. Those are the more appropriate, accurate terms. And there's been a great deal of, because of this confusion, there's been a great deal of manipulation within the marketplace of companies saying, hey, listen, we do this all the time. It's like a hybrid. It's like, a plum. You wouldn't have this if we hadn't if we hadn't created a hybrid grape without a seed like this. But we're talking about something very different. And when we were talking about this transgenic technology, the concern is there have been no long-term tests. The one study that's been done, that was done on pregnant and non-pregnant women in Canada, it was a small study. It appeared in a peer-reviewed journal called Reproductive Technology 2 summers ago, and it basically said that there was evidence in the fetus of the pregnant mother, there was evidence of this BT feed, this corn. So it had actually been corn that had been fed to the cow in Canada that was eaten by the mother and then crossed over the placental barrier into the baby at higher rates than it did for non-pregnant women. So what we do know is exposure is high. What we also know is the use of pesticides and insecticides on the plants is at much higher rates because they're resistant to the pesticides. So we're increasing our exposure to pesticides that are known carcinogens. They're known cancer-causing substances. The second study that's been done recently was done just like a month ago in France on laboratory rats. There are a few problems with this study, but I'll tell you, the person who did the study, Dr. Seralini, I have spoken with him, and I think his science, I think he does really good work, but this was an unfortunate set of circumstances where there was the longest study that's ever been done on animals being fed a diet of non-GMO food or grain and then GMO grain. The rats that were fed GMOs, again, terrible acronym because it's confusing, let's say GE, genetically engineered corn or feed, I'm not sure if it was corn, developed tumors at higher rates. But the study was dismissed because those rats were already prone to get more tumors and because so many rats died over the cycle of the study. So my concern is, in this situation, the absence of evidence is being used as the reason that we should not have labeling and that we should eat this food all the time, rather than the presence of solid science. But we see that there have been studies on the animals that are consuming this feed, and they've had tremendous problems with their digestive system, that we've seen evidence of cancer in these animals. But again, because there's not been a direct study on humans in a controlled environment, we don't have any case to say that there's a problem. What I would say is, because we can point to all these other problems, we should be paying attention and exercise a more precautionary approach. And certainly have the choice. If nothing else, we should know it's there, and we should be able to make the choice to choose to eat something else if we wish.
Well, I don't trust the tomatoes that I buy in the store. I feel like maybe they are GE or GMO because they're like rocks and they have no taste. So,
if you're buying them in season, that would first be, seasonality, yeah.
In season.
Certainly, that's not one of the most genetically engineered crops. The very first crop that was ever genetically engineered was a tomato. It was called the Flavor Savor tomato. It was actually created in North America and exported to Italy. where they used it unbeknownst to them. It was used in tomato paste. But that's really a function of a poor hybrid rather than a genetically engineered tomato in large part.
Okay, that's good to know.
There's still many other things we can worry about, but less so there. Yes, thank you.
It's funny how there are pauses during speeches like this, and everyone kind of freaks out for a second. Could you tell us if there's been a successful boycott of Monsanto, or what activists are doing right now on the ground to help fight, I guess boycott is the best word, GEOs, what have you, in stores? Is it possible to avoid these things without the labeling? And what sources of information are there for everyday people to find out about this kind of activism?
There have been a number of great acts of courage, I would say, around resistance to genetically modified organisms or genetically engineered food. One of the greatest arguments that you hear is, especially from Monsanto, this is actually their marketing line, is, we need this food to feed the world. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has done studies that show we don't need this food to feed the world, first of all. And secondly, if we needed this food to feed the world, then we should probably create more genetically engineered food. What we create in large part, just to allay some of the fears here, is we genetically engineer a lot of soy, a lot of corn, and a lot of cotton. Those are the some of the biggest crops that we genetically engineer. The corn and soy are feeding animals that we ultimately, many of us, are eating. Or they're feeding fuel tanks for biofuels. So there's a lot of questions around that and a lot of challenges. Greenpeace actually has done some of the strongest actions against genetically engineered food. And I struggle with this, I'll tell you, as the daughter of scientists, to encourage field trials to be destroyed. But I will tell you, Greenpeace has destroyed genetically engineered test crops in France, in Australia. Genetically engineered wheat is in clinical trials right now, which is particularly poignant for Turkey and for where I lived in the U.S. and Kansas, because once it hits that level of our food system, it's such a ubiquitous layer, it will be everywhere. But right now, there are only clinical trials going on, and then some of the trials that were done in Australia were those crops were destroyed by Greenpeace. I would say farmers have really spoken out about this. India has banned genetically engineered foods. China has banned genetically engineered food crops. So you're allowed to grow crops in China for animals or for textiles, but not for human consumption. But the lines get thinner and thinner, and I worry that this kind of decision in California will have greater implications for the rest of the world. I would say some of the strongest advocacy and support that I feel is important to pay attention to is really what's coming out of Africa. Because the Gates Foundation, which is a large, massive NGO, humanitarian NGO, has put a lot of money into genetically engineered foods. And again, back to this idea that this is the only way we can feed starving people is to genetically engineer food. Again, if this were the case, then we would grow more food, first of all, and then secondly, we would not sue farmers, and we would not create farm seed contracts, and we would not create seeds that terminate after one growing season. We would encourage farmers to share seeds. We would encourage all these things if we really, I think, cared about feeding people. So there's some really great bits of information that are coming out of Friends of the Earth in Africa is one of the names of the organizations I would suggest looking at. I think Greenpeace has some terrific information. The Center for Food Safety in the United States is another example. The research organization in France known as CRIGEN, CRIGEN, is the think tank under which Seralini did his work, but also the organization that's been largely responsible for keeping GMOs, GE, out of the EU. So I think just as a scientific organization, CRIGEN is also a wonderful organization to look at. And in terms of your final question about how do we ensure that we're not consuming or ingesting this food, is to look for organic food or to continue to fight for keeping genetically engineered foods out of the food system here.
How do you feel about urban farming and the new sort of trendy rooftop garden kind of culture that's popping up across cities? Do you have contact with quite a few people who have successfully cultivated their own urban space and grown vegetables that they can share with neighbors or somehow produced for a restaurant or what have you? Have you come across people like that in your line of work that have successfully pulled this off?
Yes. I spent 16 years in New York City before I moved to Kansas. And one of my best friends started the Kansas City Center for Urban Agriculture that really encouraged farmers in poor Black neighborhoods largely to grow food for their community. So it wasn't just an act of growing food for me, it was really an act of growing health and growing justice, empowering people to have different streams of income and also growing healthy food and having a stronger connection to the earth. There are a lot of organizations, urban agriculture organizations in New York City that are doing terrific things. Those are the ones I'm most familiar with, but also in Oakland, California, there are some great examples of urban gardening, and throughout Germany, I've seen some beautiful examples because you don't really need a lot of land to grow a lot of food if you know what you're doing. There's a great book called Food Not Lawns, which really encourages using urban space to grow food instead of to growing grass. And I really also like a lot of what I'm seeing around urban agriculture with fruit tree projects. So cities are, instead of just growing beautiful trees, they're growing trees that bear fruit so that the public can eat that fruit and have access to that food. So I think that's been a really great model as well. The one concern that we've seen in New York City is that, and I would say it would be a concern in many other places also, would be paint and pollution in those areas has actually compromised some of the quality of the food. So, for example, in the U.S., in New York, in Brooklyn, there's lead contamination in the soil, so there's higher rates of lead on those fruits and vegetables. So that's one of the challenges of growing food in an urban environment is you will have the exposure of everything that's in that urban environment. So I think initially farmers weren't paying attention to that in the urban center, but now that's becoming part of the awareness that we need to kind of think about the soil. And rooftop gardens are great for that because you can, take the soil from elsewhere. The levels of lead were largely, some of it was airborne, but it was also from soil that had been on the ground for a long time. Yeah.
You said something like considering our bodies like a machine, how bad that is. But we keep doing that. For instance, we drink coffee to be able to stay awake or share during the work. Or we go to the fast food restaurant because we only have something like half an hour maximum to eat. And I remembered one of my friends quote about food thing. He was saying, well, I can't trust any kind of food anyway, because we can't know what the ingredients. So, yeah, let's go to the McDonald's or let's go to the Starbucks. Anyway, I want to ask, how can we, do you think, break this cycle of distrust and do something really meaningful about this?
You have such a hard question. It's not easy. I mean, I think it's wonderful and incredibly rewarding. But I will tell you, I went to my friend, I'm in Istanbul for the first time since May. I've been moving my house. I went to my friend Daisy's for lunch, for dinner. It was the first home-cooked meal I had had in 1 month. I hadn't cooked anything for myself. It's appalling. I have to come all the way to Istanbul to have a home-cooked meal. So I understand and I have great sympathy for what you're saying. I think we're all busy and we're all tired. But something breaks down when we disconnect from our body, and when we disconnect from each other, and when we disconnect from our food. And if food was something in isolation, I don't think it would be such a problem. But food connects to everything. Food connects to the environment, and as I said before, the economy, to our community, to our culture, to our history, to our future, to our living, to our sustenance. And when we look at, anthropologists have looked at what's happening to the human body and what's happening to the diet. And these things surprise no one, right? The human population is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and less healthy, and the diet is getting less nutritious. It's full of, in the US, I can certainly say, corn, because at one point corn was very cheap. So the manufacturers started putting corn into everything. They turned corn into sugar. They turned corn into feed for animals. Animals that should not eat corn still now eat corn, are eating corn. So corn became the staple of the American diet. And now I think more and more we rely on someone else to feed us. And Daphne actually said this to me. She took me out 2 years ago, almost exactly to this day. She took me to lunch. And I was saying, like, I don't cook, and I wasn't saying, like, I don't cook. I just said, I don't cook. When I was a child, I saw my mother cook, and I thought to myself, when I'm an adult, I am never going to have to do that. And I remember you leaning into me, and you said, the most revolutionary act you can do is to feed yourself. You said something like this, is to be able to feed yourself. And that stayed with me. I've butchered it a little bit, but it stayed with me. That the most powerful thing we can do is be able to feed ourselves and take care of ourselves. So I would say the non-easy solution is to start cooking and to start growing things in little pots, and to take back our system, to not be broken by Monsanto pouring $7 million into a law to hide what's in their food, but to say that I'm going to find another way to feed myself that doesn't require me to eat your food. And this is a bit of a luxury because it requires time. But what we also often hear is, well, it's also so expensive. I would argue that feeding yourself is ultimately much cheaper than anything you can buy day after day because of the health implications of eating bad food outside all the time, because of the kinds of things that are put into the food, that when we treat ourselves with a little more respect and a little less like a machine, then maybe we will start to extend that to other people. A sense of compassion and slowness and generosity and caring. Because again, I can only speak about the US, and I was a bit appalled, actually. I only realized in retrospect that the poster for this event was pigs, I will say I gave Salt a few choices, and you picked the pig picture, but I was like, maybe this wasn't the best choice for turkey. But in the US, pigs, we treat these animals like dirt, like machines. And in China, the people making our iPhones are treated like machines. And we're losing our sense of connection with humanity and with each other. And that's trust breaking. That's what the break of trust looks like. So I think we have to knit ourselves back together, come back together, and it starts with making different decisions about how we feed ourselves. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, thank God. Okay, good. So we all can go. You already saw. Yes. You are absolutely right. And this is what trust is again, right? It's reciprocity. It's the circular relationship. It's the sense of community Daphne is talking about, that we don't have to be completely self-reliant, that we can work together and work with each other and feed each other, nourish each other, and that nourishment comes in many forms. So I still wholeheartedly believe that act of feeding yourself is incredibly powerful, and we all need to do it. But maybe we don't need to do it all the time. We could go to Tiffany's for dinner. I'll give you her address when I get to my phone. Exactly.
So I actually wanted to touch on this relationship of trust with companies, larger companies like McDonald's and Starbucks that are really well known. And I'm curious to see, it's interesting to see the conversation in the United States has become much more prevalent the sicker people have gotten. And there has been a link, it seems like, with the way food has changed and the way people have been getting sick. And I'm curious to see, in your experience, having gone to different countries and seen different food cultures and seen different food habits, how people are getting sick and how much sicker do you think people have to get to realize that their trust is being broken? They're not being poisoned as in food poisoning. That trust isn't that immediate result. But there is a link between diseases that are prevalent in the United States or in Western food cultures that aren't prevalent in the food cultures that don't have these sort of things that exist or in it yet.
Absolutely. The shocking thing to me is that my father, so we immigrated from Germany, I'm Indian, we immigrated from Germany to the United States because my father worked in cancer research. So, I'm 42 years old. So for 42 years I've expected, and my father has hoped and prayed all his work would mean that cancer rates would be going down. The technology, the science has advanced so much. But what we see is cancer rates have either stayed the same or have gone up as a result of diet and environmental factors. So people are getting sicker. To answer your question around what is the tipping point for when people will start to wake up, what I would like to say is I think it's happening now. I think people are finally starting to understand that the person who has to take care of them is themselves. But one of the biggest challenges that we see is that the places in the world now, it used to just be in the US, but now we see this, McDonald's is everywhere, as one example. The places that have the highest rates of food insecurity, which is also known as hunger, are the places that have the highest rates of poverty, are the places that have the highest rates of obesity. So logic would dictate, 20, 30, 40 years ago, you would see starving people and they were all this big, right? They were skinny, starving people in my country of India, right? People are starving now and they're this big, right? Because they're not being fed well. And this compromises people's neurological capacity. So it's not just a matter of being big, it's a matter of not being as effective in the world because you're not able to learn. You don't have the capacity to learn as well, right? You can't move as quickly, much less all the health problems that you will accrue over your lifetime. And we're reaching, certainly in the United States, a real crisis around a nation now that is the generation, my generation, alive today, if I had children. I don't, but that my children would not outlive me. Like, I am the first generation that will not outlive my children. So I think people are starting to really wake up and understand something terrible has happened. And you also see the introduction, even within the fast food chains, of more, this happens in cycles, more healthier food. So more salads at McDonald's, a healthier menu at the Taco Bell, etc. I don't know where this will go, but I think it can only start with people having better information. And to that end, I think people are starting to understand. And also, obesity is linked to depression, so it's this terrible cycle of people feeling really unmotivated when they get bigger, and then they can't move, and then they don't want to move because they don't, they feel bad, and so again, diet, like what you put in your mouth isn't just about the caloric nourishment and the energy. It's about a whole host of things in terms of how it affects you. Anyone else? Here comes the microphone.
I think that, can you hear me? I think that we're talking shouldn't have your iPhone because you know how that iPhone was made. Are you going to stop using it? No, you're not. And it's the same with food. We are in the fortunate position that we can choose.
You know what else we're in the fortunate position also of being able to help other people make informed decisions and being able to fight for people who don't have those choices. So, you know, I'll tell you, I can eat organic food every day of the week. I have enough money. I don't need to rely too much. I mean, of course, I'm in America, so I'll have some genetically engineered food no matter what. But this fight isn't for me. This fight is for farmers in India, farmers in Africa who are being pushed, you know, the seed is being pushed on them that you must grow this. This is how you will be fed. I'm going to be over here eating my organic food, but you can eat this food. So that's really what I think, with our privilege comes a sense of responsibility to act on this privilege, to we have the luxury to choose something better, so we bloody well should do it. Or try, you know, the best we can. Thank you all so much. Thank you.